Hello and welcome to another online lesson in the Elizabethan England course. In this lesson we're going to be looking at the story of Mary Queen of Scots, why is she dangerous for Elizabeth and what happens to her. Personally, this is one of my favourite stories in the whole Tudor period. Mary Queen of Scots, a little bit Marmite. Let's see what you think as we go through this story. Okay, so before we start, it's important to understand why Mary Queen of Scots is a genuine and legitimate claimant to the throne. So if you just look at this family tree, if we just start with Henry VII and we go down, we can see quite clearly the names that we know from the Henry VIII side. Henry gets married to Catherine of Aragon, then Anne Boleyn, and then Jane Seymour. That's because Arthur has already died, who was the heir to the throne. So when Henry becomes king in 1509, he sends his sister, Margaret, up to Scotland, probably for some sort of political alliance, as is always a good thing, because as we know that Scotland and France have traditionally had this old alliance, so that was probably quite a sensible thing for Henry VIII to do, to send this sister up to Scotland. So Margaret marries the King of Scotland, who is James IV, and they have a child. They have James V, who becomes King James V. James V then marries Mary de Guise, or Mary of Guise, who we know a little bit about already, and their child is Mary Queen of Scots. So if you follow that family tree all the way back, you know that if we've carried on from Henry VIII's family down to Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, none of his children had kids themselves. So then we have to go back up to the family tree to find the next in line. Obviously Arthur's dead, so we go to the next family member who could be legitimate, which is Margaret. Now she's a while ago, so she's dead, but we will go down Margaret's line, which is, in a way, if you sort of think about it, sometimes you might have a barbecue or a family gathering from the other side of the family, so your cousins and things that you don't really see that often, but they are obviously related to you through your aunties and cousins and things like that. So hopefully with this little diagram on the screen you can see that, and it makes a little bit of sense. Just out of interest, which we'll see shortly, in our Mary Queen of Scots story, is this Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, her second husband, just for interest's sake and the giggles, you can see that they're also related through Mary Queen of Scots' grandma. When they get married, a little bit weird, but this is the Tudors. Okay, so if you need to pause the video, just have a little look at that yourself and maybe draw out the path to power or write a little paragraph if that'll help. You just need to understand why Mary Queen of Scots is legit. Alright, she is a Tudor, she is related to the Tudor royal family. It's not just some convenient other person who may be able to be queen. Also keep in mind that she is a Catholic, and remembering that at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, 90% of the country, give or take, are Catholics. Okay, when you're ready and you're confident with Mary Queen of Scots' claim to the throne, we can move on. So, just to give you an overall, it's a bit of a spoiler coming here now, but just the timeline, you can pause this video at the end of the timeline, or as we go through each part of it, just make some notes in your book or wherever you're writing this up, watching the video. But this is the overall picture of where Mary Queen of Scots is going to fit in. So when we move on to other topics, especially the plot, which is going to be next, you'll be able to try and hopefully understand where she fits in. Okay, so firstly, if we start in 1559, so that's the year after Elizabeth becomes queen, this is the year she passes the religious settlement, the Scottish Protestant lords rebel. Alright, there's a rebellion in Scotland. So quite conveniently for Elizabeth, Scotland then becomes Protestant, which is hopefully going to probably make her sleep a little bit better, to have that Protestant alliance just north of your own country. So in 1560, 1 year later, the rebellion ends with the Treaty of Edinburgh, which is basically happened because of Elizabeth's support. So that's good again. So England is starting to forge a fairly useful relationship with Scotland, especially as a new queen. We know, don't we, that the war with France and therefore the issue with Scotland was always a problem for Elizabeth initially. So this is a little bit of backstory to that too, that we could maybe add to our previous work on this part. In 1561, so a couple of years later, Mary Queen of Scots arrives in the newly anti-French and Protestant Scotland. This is after her husband Francis dies. With no claim to England after the treaty, she doesn't accept the Treaty of Edinburgh, and she demands to be named Elizabeth's heir. So she's been in France, we'll find out more about this in this lesson, but then she finds herself up in Scotland. Bear in mind that Elizabeth has already had a little bit of an issue with Mary de Guise, up in Scotland, as we looked at a couple of lessons ago. That is Mary Queen of Scots' mum. She was essentially in Scotland ruling on behalf of her daughter, who was in France. So that sort of explains that little bit of the story there. We know that Scotland's been a bit of an iffy start. She sent those troops up to Scotland to fight Mary the Guise, and as we know, it didn't go particularly well. So in 1561, when Mary goes back to Scotland after being turfed out of France, she finds Scotland as Protestant, a little bit anti-French, so an interesting place. Probably not much different to Elizabeth finding the country, her own country, England, pretty anti-Protestant as well. All right, so let me go forward a couple of years up in Scotland while Elizabeth's been establishing the country and, getting on with it. Mary marries her second husband, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. As we've just seen on the family tree, they are related, but, we're not here to judge. In 1566, 1 year later, they don't waste any time, Mary gives birth to a son, James. He will, of course, go on to become James I of England and James VI of Scotland, the same person. And just for a little backstory to that, that is the one who Guy Fawkes tries to blow up in the Gunpowder Plot. Okay, 1567, Lord Darnley is murdered, which we'll talk about more in this lesson. Mary marries again a guy called Bothwell, the Earl of Bothwell. She is captured by the Scottish Protestant lords in connection with King Darnley's murder and is arrested. In 1568, now this is the crucial turning point. If you remember back a few weeks ago to when the Catholic threat started to get a little bit controversial for Elizabeth, in 1566, around that time, is when the Pope started telling Catholics not to go to her church. In 1568, we know, don't we, from our previous work, that Mary Queen of Scots is going to arrive in England. All right, so she tries to raise an army against the Scottish lords for imprisoning her, but she is defeated. She abdicates, so remember that word from the Germany course, she abdicates, stepping down, and flees to England, hoping probably that Elizabeth will help her. And we'll talk more of that in this lesson, but that is a turning point, the why. If you just want to have a little pause, maybe write the why while you're making these notes, and then come back to the video. Okay, so the why is quite simply Mary, this possible figurehead for all of the Catholics. She's now in England. All right, and in this lesson we'll see pros and cons of what to do with Mary now that she's there. Okay, in 1569, Mary is blamed for the Northern Rebellion. So we've talked about the Northern Rebellion briefly already. In the next couple of lessons, as I say, we're going to do more detail on that. But it's no coincidence, is it, that the Northern Rebellion takes place so soon after Mary arrives in England. So she is blamed for that, and she's placed under house arrest in England until her death, quite a while later in 1587. All right, but as long as she's alive from this point on, she's going to be a figurehead for any Catholic plot, isn't she? As we know, that's why she's so dangerous, and we need to keep referring back to that all the way through. And most questions that would talk about a threat to Elizabeth, then Mary Queen of Scots is definitely going to be one of our bullet points to think about. Okay, in 1587, following those 4 plots, she is finally executed. The problem with her being executed, and this is why Elizabeth has taken such a long time to do it, nearly 20 years, is because she doesn't want to set a precedent of killing a queen. Now remember divine right monarchy, okay, so God has chosen this queen as much as he's chosen Elizabeth. If Elizabeth goes on to kill a queen, she's essentially saying that it's okay to kill a queen, which might give some people in her own country a few ideas. So that's why it took so long, and in the end, after 4 plots, allegedly in Mary Queen of Scots' name, she's finally executed. So this is a bit of this is the timeline of the story. You probably try and need to know that if you can, but there's some seriously important bits. 1568 for sure, and then 1587 she's finally killed, and by that point, although you could argue this is going to stoke the flames of war with Spain by 1587, for me, and we'll talk about this nearer the time, that the Spanish Armada was coming anyway, but certainly this is just going to add a little sting to the tail, and instead of maybe Philip trying to rescue Mary Queen of Scots, he now might try and avenge Mary Queen of Scots' death. So not the best thing to do, but I suppose the longer Elizabeth keeps Mary Queen of Scots alive, plot after plot after plot, she's looking very, very weak, isn't she? So she has to do something about this, and she does quite decisively in the end. Okay, so that's the little timeline. So let's talk about the story of Mary Queen of Scots, just for the backstory. You'll not need to discuss any of this in your exam. except for a little bit of context. But just so you know the story of Mary Queen of Scots. So the image is on the board on the screen now. As we go through the next couple of minutes of this lesson, you need to try and visualize in the pictures, and hopefully that means the story will stick in your head. So we can see here that Mary Queen of Scots is Queen of Scots. All right, so the arrow is pointing to Scotland, lovely Christian country as always. So that's where we start. All right, so she goes to France as a little girl, to be honest. So she becomes Queen of Scotland when she's 6 days old. So she goes to France, probably to live with her mum for a while, marry the Guise. And she grows up with this Francis guy. They've been obviously grown up since they were kids. They get married, but then unfortunately Francis dies. And he dies of an ear infection probably. But lots of people in France sort of blame Mary Queen of Scots for this. So with Francis dead, she is then turfed out of France and sent home back to Scotland. And as we've seen in that little timeline, that's when she discovers that Scotland is of course now Protestant. All right, so she arrives home. Oh, she missed Sterling there. And she realises her country's Protestant, but she is the queen, just like in England. The people just generally have to accept it. Okay, so she's going to have to try and win them round, very much similarly to how Elizabeth had to do this when she became queen. The difference really being is that Mary Queen of Scots is a little bit more experienced. She's been raised to be a queen and to play politics, whereas Elizabeth had to sort of learn on the job really. Okay, so she's in Scotland now. The French bit's sort of over. Let's see what happens next. So she then marries Lord Darnley, all right, and he is quite abusive to Elizabeth. He's a drunk. He gets drunk a lot, and he's quite abusive. There is some suggestions that he may well have assaulted Mary Queen of Scots in the worst ways possible, physically, sexually, and obviously just being abusive as well. So she's not having much luck with men, is our Mary, that's for sure. But fact is now that they're married and Lord Darnley is the king. Mary Queen of Scots essentially follows the dutiful role as the wife. The problem with Darnley is he is from England, and he's been sent by Elizabeth, probably tactically, to try and control Mary, really, in a way of hopefully not worrying too much about a Scottish invasion, not Spanish. Okay, so then we have a little issue where Mary Queen of Scots is quite good friends with a guy called Rizzio, and Lord Darnley is very jealous. So you can imagine in one of his alcoholic rages, gets quite jealous of Mary and Rizzio's relationship. Rizzio is her secretary, so is pretty much with her a lot of the time. They're not in love. Very simply, Rizzio is gay. All right, but that doesn't stop Darnley being particularly jealous. So this relationship takes a little bit of a twist when Darnley and his men bounce into the room with Mary and Rizzio one evening. You can see in this picture, Mary is being held back at knife point, and Rizzio is stabbed about 50 to 60 times, we think, or give or take a few stabbings more or less, and is murdered by Darnley. With knife at Mary Queen of Scots' belly, and she is pregnant at the time. So that was even more traumatic. Just for a little bit of a plot twist, though, in this, very interestingly, Lord Darnley may well have been a little bit more involved in this situation. And when I say may well have been, absolutely was, as he was, in fact, having an affair with Rizzio himself. So that was nice. He's killed his lover in a rage. All right, so you can imagine that Mary Queen of Scots is a little bit devastated, or quite devastated to say the least. So maybe gets to plotting a little bit. But unfortunately, before we plot there, the baby is born. I feel like, without getting too judgy here, that is a face only a mother could love. Baby James, a handsome baby, he is born. And he will go on, as I've said, to become King James I of England. All right, so Lord Darnley is not getting away with killing Mary Queen of Scots' friend, very, very, very close friends, and he is, of course, killed. Now, the issue here is, it's quite controversial. They attempt to blow him up, but he manages to get out, and he gets into the garden of a little house in Edinburgh, and he is then stabbed to death and finished off by Mary Queen of Scots' nobles. So Darnley's gone. So she's essentially killed the King of England, or certainly, allegedly, has killed the King of Scotland. Sorry, King of Scotland. All right, so Darnley's gone. Mary and James are free for the time being. Now, of course, if you're Mary, Queen of Scots, as we've seen, she's obviously not one for being single for too long. She then marries a guy called the Earl of Bothwell, about 3 months later, probably, which is never a good look, is it, when your husband's just been blown up and you may be trying to claim innocence. Interestingly, then, that Bothwell is the one who did the killing, or certainly orchestrated the killing. So she's married the guy who has killed her husband. Again, a little bit of backstory, really, just for this. That Bothwell may well have forced himself onto Mary, and being the dutiful, good Catholic that she was, she felt now that had happened, she really had no choice to marry Bothwell. But to be fair, looking at some of the correspondence between the two of them, this is probably something that had been brewing a little bit anyway. So Mary, Queen of Scots, husband number 3, but the death, we've got to deal with the death of the king. So as a result of this, Mary, Queen of Scots is arrested for killing Darnley. She is forced to abdicate, as we've talked about. So the throne falls to baby James, so he becomes King of Scotland as a baby. Obviously, he's going to have someone doing that on his behalf until he's of age, and they will be, of course, the Protestant nobles. So James is going to grow up a Protestant. Keep that in mind for later on. All right. So as a result of this, then, Mary, Queen of Scots is in prison. She is going to make ways to England. She escapes prison, hoping that her cousin, Elizabeth, can help her, either get her throne back or some sort of help. All right, so we'll talk about that shortly in this lesson, but this is the date that's really important. 1568, 10 years into Elizabeth's reign, finally, her biggest challenger is now on English soil. And again, please remember the context of this. 1 year later is the Northern Rebellion. As it is, Elizabeth doesn't help her. Elizabeth puts her in house arrest, particularly after the Northern Rebellion. There she stays for about 20 years. That old saying, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, definitely could count here. So Mary, Queen of Scots, she's had a bit of a traumatic couple of years, it's fair to say. Some really tragic, some of her own making. Either way, it doesn't matter. You can think what you want of Mary, Queen of Scots. Personally, I spent many years not overly a fan of her, thinking she was a bit devious. But actually, as the years go on and I read a little bit more about Mary, I do start to feel a little bit more sympathy for her for some of the way that history has presented her. But of course, as they always say, history is written by the winners. And Elizabeth's propaganda machine definitely will have made Mary, Queen of Scots to be a bit of a wrong'un. Okay, so that's the backstory. Like I say, you're not going to have to necessarily talk about any of this in the exam, but I feel like it's important to get some depth to Mary, Queen of Scots before we move on to the actual content of what we might need to be worried about in our exam. So, just pause the video and just try and write the story off memory. Obviously, this says talk to your partner, but if you've got one there, that'd be good if you're watching this with somebody. If not, just pause it and answer the questions in the little bullet points there, and then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on. Okay, let's go. So, Mary's now in England. Let's take a moment just to sort of step back a little bit and consider why this is a problem, and these little speech bubbles are definitely going to be the things you're going to consider talking about in a paragraph about why Mary, Queen of Scots is a threat. Alright, so it's very much worth taking the time to watch this carefully, pausing the video if you need to make some notes around each one, or to talk about, or to even rank each one as a particular danger. I'll just talk really quickly through them while we're watching the video. Obviously you can pause and play at your will. So Mary has a lot of support in Europe. She is especially supported in France, particularly with the Catholics, where she was, of course, married to their last king. She was raised in France as well. She is the daughter of Marie de Guise. The de Guise family are very powerful in France. So if Elizabeth is worried about any potential, France might be a place that could come from. Alright, so if we go down underneath that, as heir to the throne, Mary could attract the support of any discontented nobles who feel they have been excluded from power. Now, the Northern Rebellion, when we see that in a few more lessons time, the detail of that, now that bullet point there, sorry, that speech bubble is definitely something there. If Elizabeth upsets these nobles, they've got a ready-made replacement, as Boris Johnson might say, an oven-ready monarch. So it's important that Elizabeth doesn't upset the nobles too much, because they will just turn their support to Mary, Queen of Scots, who is, of course, legitimate. And then underneath that, Mary is far more dangerous to Elizabeth in England. Some English Catholics think she is the rightful Queen of England. And that's because most of them, remember, don't believe Elizabeth is legitimate in the first place because marriage number 1 never ended. All right. The Scots in the middle want Elizabeth to send Mary back to Scotland so she can go on trial for killing Darnley. But Elizabeth's not too keen on helping the subjects against the Queen. This is this whole idea of divine right monarchy. Even though Mary Queen of Scots is probably a bit of a wrong 'un and has probably caused this death of Darnley, Elizabeth's not overly keen on just handing her over. Possibly that might be the most sensible thing to do because it means that Elizabeth doesn't necessarily have to do it. But that is an issue there. What is Elizabeth going to do? Which we'll talk about a little bit later in this lesson. Also, Mary is Elizabeth's cousin. She has been appointed by God, remember, divine right monarchy. So she sort of sees the dilemma here in that it's her duty to help a fellow monarch. We'll see in a sec what she's going to do. The Privy Council wants to keep on friendly terms with the Protestant lords in Scotland. So remember that Scotland has turned Protestant not that long ago. So Cecil and Dudley, the Scottish nobles in the Privy Council, they're Puritans, they're Protestants. So they want Elizabeth to remain on friendly terms with the Scottish Protestant nobles. So they want to send Mary Queen of Scots back to them so they can deal with them. Elizabeth is a little bit hesitant. That would definitely be a debate that might get heated in a Privy Council meeting. Remember, with 19 Privy Councillors meeting 3 times a week in normal times, this is certainly a time when they would get together when Mary has arrived in England. All right, and then finally, for a consideration here on why this is very dangerous for Elizabeth, is some of the councillors and members of Parliament think that Mary is too great a threat and they want Elizabeth to just get rid of her. And that comes down to, again, our sort of options and choices that we'll talk about in a sec. What does Elizabeth do? What are the pros and cons of getting rid of her, sending her to Scotland, letting her go to Europe, or keeping her in England? We have to decide, really. But the point of this little screen here is that she is, in fact, a threat. So, again, as I've just said previously, if you want to pause the video and rank these issues in order of most serious, probably we want 2 or 3 confident examples that you can throw into a paragraph on Mary Queen of Scots. And when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on with this lesson. Alright, so the cousins then, a little bit of context to them. So they are cousins, they haven't really seen each other, well they haven't ever. The movies and Hollywood may often present that they met face to face. They never met ever face to face, but they did correspond a lot. So that's important to keep in mind, okay? They wrote loads of letters to each other, usually from Mary to Elizabeth asking for help. But Elizabeth has wrote letters back to Mary Queen of Scots telling Mary how to behave, trying to get Mary to behave more like a queen, and also to try and make a bond and improve relations. Elizabeth is very jealous of Mary's looks. Elizabeth, as we know, is very, very vain, and Mary was very attractive, certainly for the time. She was well known around Europe as being a rather good-looking lady. Mary knew that Elizabeth could not kill an anointed queen, as it would set that precedent that we've talked about, so might encourage Mary to push her luck a little bit, knowing full well that Elizabeth is probably not going to kill her. Alright, and Elizabeth really just hoped that Mary would just go away. You know, like an annoying little fly that just sort of hangs on. If you open the window, hopefully it'll go away. But she deep down knows that she's going to have to do something eventually. So that's the sort of backstory there to this weird relationship. They're cousins. They sort of get on a little bit by letter. But there's also a political problem here and religious. Alright, so just to think about then Darnley, why he's important. So Darnley's been sent up to Scotland by Elizabeth to hopefully control Mary. As we've seen, by 1561, Mary has gone home from France, marries this Darnley character, and then he's dead very shortly after. Elizabeth sends her sympathies to her, quote, sweet sister and fellow monarch. Obviously, that's probably a little bit early on, before it comes clear that probably Mary Queen of Scots was more involved. But even by that, you can see that Elizabeth is on rather good terms with Mary, essentially, in this letter, or at least pretending to be. Alright, so after the murder, it goes a little bit south. Mary starts displaying England's coat of arms to show her claim to the throne. So England's coat of arms on Mary, Queen of Scots, tapestries in the castle where she lives. She's essentially walking around saying that she should be King of England, Queen of England. Obviously, this makes Elizabeth furious. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about where Elizabeth says in these letters, just stop it, Mary, and we'll be okay. But she obviously can't help herself. In 65, she then marries Darnley, who has this claim to the English throne as well, because they are related, as you've seen on the family tree. So it all gets a little bit murky, the waters. They have a son together, so baby James, the handsome baby, is legitimate because he is born in wedlock to Darnley and Mary Queen of Scots. So she now has one up on Elizabeth in the fact that she has an heir to the throne. That's the one thing that Elizabeth is holding off on, which means Mary Queen of Scots, not only as a Catholic, she now has a bit of an advantage for those people who just want a nice, secure succession and plan. Everyone knows what's going to happen. Everyone can relax a little bit. So 67, Elizabeth strongly criticises Mary for marrying Bothwell, the guy who is allegedly the chief suspect in the murder. There's no way, I'm pretty confident in saying to you, that Mary did not know that was going to happen and have some say in it, particularly following the whole Rizzio murder. But whether there's proof of that, we shall see in a mo. All right, and then just clarifying this a little bit as the years go on. Just a reminder, she's came to England after escaping prison. She's asked for Elizabeth's help in regaining her throne. This makes the relationship now a little bit more controversial, a little bit more annoying for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is now in an impossible position. Does she help Mary Queen of Scots, who has just murdered a king and an English noble at that too, or does she not and then puts a queen in prison and potentially even kills a queen? It's all just got a little bit messy. That honeymoon period, the first 10 years, is definitely not going so well. Just a reminder, while we're here, that the Catholic threat is starting to bubble a little bit from Europe too, with the Pope's letters to the Catholics at home saying don't go to her church. So this 1567-68 period, 69 for the Northern Rebellion, just getting a wee bit messy. All right. So we reckon that Elizabeth's preference was probably to restore Mary to her throne through negotiation, so diplomacy and politics. This would obviously secure an alliance with Scotland. Mary would never ever dream of invading England or with Spain or France or anyone, because Mary Queen of Scots will essentially be indebted to Elizabeth for helping her get her throne back. That's the pro of that, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll look at the negative of that possible option. If Mary agrees to this, goes back on the throne, she never gives a claim to England again, so stops running around with the English claim coat of arms, then Elizabeth may well help her. These are what probably is identified in some of the letters. All right, so her failure to do this, by her we mean Mary. Mary can't help herself, can she? So partly due to the councillors as well, wanting Mary kept close. Whatever happens in the end, Mary remains in England. Okay, so Elizabeth doesn't help Mary get her throne back. Mary has proved to be a bit of a schemer. She writes letters to the Catholic powerhouses of Europe. Okay, so the Pope, Philip in Spain, English Catholics, probably some French Catholics. I don't know necessarily if we could say plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, but if you look at the sort of backstory on this page, she's running around with the English coat of arms. She's writing letters to powerful Catholics in Europe. Can you see why perhaps Elizabeth was a little bit paranoid, a little bit worried about Mary? So in the end, Mary is kept in England in house arrest. And we'll learn about these plots in the next couple of lessons. So there's 4 in total by the time we kill Mary Queen of Scots. And each of them either in her name or allegedly with her knowing. And of course, if that is the case, then that would be treason. All right. So here is your opportunity to think a little bit now of the options available to Elizabeth. So keep in mind while we do this little task, Mary is an anointed queen. So Elizabeth can't just go around killing her, because that would mean it's almost okay to do that. And we need to try and keep this mystic or mystique up about royalty being chosen by God. Secondly, she is aware of the danger of Mary being in England because of the Catholics, the Catholic nobles, the Pope, European Catholics. So doing something with Mary is important, but what she does next could make or break her reign. All right. So she can keep Mary under comfortable house arrest. That doesn't mean necessarily that she's in a I don't know, a jail somewhere, chained to a wall. But as long as she is alive, she is a danger to Elizabeth. So your options, if you just pause this video when we finish this little introduction to the task and write some pros and cons of each of these options. So for number 1, what is a pro and a con of helping Mary to regain her throne? You can think of as many as you want. Several pros, several cons, or maybe just the one. What would be good about letting her get her throne in Scotland back, and what would be bad? Number 2, what would be a good thing for handing Mary over to the Scottish Lords? Let them deal with her. And what would be a bad thing about that? And number 3, allow Mary, Queen of Scots, to escape to Europe, or just to go to Europe, so she doesn't have to go back to Scotland and face any sort of trial. What's a pro of that, and what's a negative of that? And finally, keep Mary in England. What's a pro and what's a con? So pause the video, go and have a little go at that, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll discuss some of the possible ideas that you could have for each of these little options. But they are the options essentially that Elizabeth has got. Okay, so we'll see you shortly after you've done this task. Okay, so some pros for number 1, helping Mary to regain her throne. Obviously, the alliance. Mary is less likely, isn't she, to invade England because she owes Elizabeth a debt of gratitude. It will also hopefully improve the potential threat from Europe, from the Catholics in Europe, because Mary, Queen of Scots, will say, no, Elizabeth's cool. She's cool. She helped me. Let's leave Elizabeth alone. So that's the obvious pro of that. The negative is that Mary, Queen of Scots, is still alive. She now has the opportunity, if she ever really wanted to, at some point later on, to regain a desire for England and possibly set up a little army up in Scotland, or bring the French Catholics or Spanish up to Scotland and they could just march down south. So it may well be a short-term thing, but can Elizabeth really trust Mary for the rest of their lives? So that might be the negative that you might have thought of yourself. Number 2, the pro of handing Mary over is that it's not on your hands. You hand her over legally for them to deal with this crime of killing Darnley. You haven't killed her technically, so you can say to any Catholics in Europe who may well be angry with the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, if that's what happened, if you hand her over to the Scottish Lords, you didn't do it. The pro of that is that you have handed over a queen to be put on trial and potentially killed, which again is not something you're overly happy with doing. The fact is that you're blood as well, that you are cousins. That's probably a negative there. Maybe you got something as well. Any extras is fine. For number 3, the positive of letting Mary go abroad is she's out of your hair. She's not there, potentially becoming a figurehead for the Catholics at home, for the nobles in England. She's gone. She's out of everyone's hair. I feel like the biggest negative, though, of her going abroad would be that she could lead some sort of Catholic invasion at some point to invade England to try and take your throne, or take Elizabeth's throne. The fact that she can't be controlled and she's running around Europe building alliances, that is a massive negative for that option. And then number 4, keep Mary in England. The positive of that is that she's not going to be plotting with, or directly plotting with, loads of people in Europe, because you've got her in England, hopefully controlled and under some sort of comfortable arrest, shall we say, living in a nice house, but just not able to communicate essentially, or communicate effectively with some Catholics abroad. But again, the big negative is, as we've always said, as long as Mary, Queen of Scots, is alive, she is a danger to Elizabeth, and she's a figurehead for any of the Catholics in England. And as we've said a few times now, there are going to be 4 plots in Mary, Queen of Scots' name to remove Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. So hopefully this little task here has given you a little bit of an insight into the context of what Elizabeth was having to deal with. I don't know if there's any particularly good option. As it was, she chose option number 4 and kept Mary in England under house arrest for about 20 years. All right, she kept moving Mary around. It's not like she was in the same place, but she kept moving Mary around, making it difficult for her to build any sort of network or plot. And you'll see in a couple of lessons' time that the final plot, the 4th one, they allegedly find letters in Mary, Queen of Scots' hand that she'd written, which essentially implicates her in a plot to remove Elizabeth, and that is going to be her end. All right, so what do you think this is? If you want to just pause the video and just write what you think it is, and then when you're ready, unpause it, we'll tell you exactly what this is. All right, so this is a letter, quite clearly, and a lovely posh looking box that we'll call a casket. So we put the two things together, we'll call these the casket letters. All right, so 8 letters in a casket regarding Darnley and evidence. So evidence that possibly implicates Mary Queen of Scots in the death of Lord Darnley. So now this has been discovered and come to light, there is now a big problem, an issue that Elizabeth is going to have to deal with, and she's not very happy. So let's have a little look at this. So this will be called, in your knowledge for this exam board and this course, you may be asked for some features of the casket letters or the York Conference in 1569. So 1 year after Mary arrives in England, these casket letters are used at the conference to try and show evidence that Mary Queen of Scots at least knew about Darnley's murder. This, of course, would then mean, if it's true, Elizabeth's going to have to do something, whether she likes it or not. She's going to have to put Mary on trial. And then if Mary is found guilty, clearly that's treasonous and Mary will have to die. So this is a terrible situation for Elizabeth to find herself in. Many people have said, and Mary herself, that these letters were forged, paid for by Elizabeth. Now, part of me would like to think that is possible, bearing in mind this is a seriously dangerous situation. Elizabeth might want to be getting rid of Mary Queen of Scots, but if that is the case, then that's going to make Elizabeth have to kill Mary, because she's got no way of denying this and will be found guilty. So why would Elizabeth want to do that? If she's going to try and be clever about this and find Mary Queen of Scots a way out of this horrible trial and not have to kill her, I don't know why Elizabeth would write letters trying to implicate her cousin. But that's another one of those really exciting things about history and this period in particular. It's a lot of intrigue, a lot of these letters. It's really exciting. So you can go off and go down a rabbit hole if you want, looking at this yourself. Maybe if some of you go on to university, this is definitely a really exciting topic to look at, especially at a higher level. So these letters are provided at the York Conference, which was set up to investigate the possible involvement of Mary. Okay, so Mary then, this sort of clever, smart woman, but finds herself in some serious problems through some really daft choices, it's got to be fair to say that, has begged Elizabeth to let her explain that she played no part in Darnley's murder. Well, of course she's going to say that, isn't she? Elizabeth refused to meet her. A court was set up to hear Mary's case, where the casket letters were allegedly written by Mary, given as evidence of her guilt. But she refused to be tried as a commoner, and she would only put in a plea of not guilty if Elizabeth guaranteed a verdict of innocence. Again, Elizabeth can't do that because that makes a mockery of a court and a trial. So Mary Queen of Scots is sort of saying, listen, I'm not a subject of England. I don't need to be put on trial by English judges. I am a queen. And Elizabeth's a bit like, well, sort of, yeah, you're right. So this is why I sort of don't think Elizabeth's got anything to do with these letters, because she's making this trial look more and more likely that Mary will be found guilty. That's the last thing that she wants. So with that in mind, we are thinking that this trial is lose-lose for Elizabeth, because if Mary is found guilty, she's going to have to die. And if Mary is found innocent, then Elizabeth is going to have to free her, because she can't keep her in prison for nothing. So just pause the video. This is quite another one of those fun little tasks to do. Pause the video and write down in your notes, in your book, however you're doing it, what can possibly be done here to try and help Elizabeth in this situation. I'm telling you at this point that it's lose-lose. If Mary's found guilty, Elizabeth will have to kill her. And if she's found innocent, Elizabeth will have to let her go. And she can, of course, go off and plot against Elizabeth with the Catholics, go to Europe, all the things we've talked about already in this lesson. And then when you're ready, when you've got a bit of an idea, unpause the video and we'll carry on and see if that's what you came up with. Okay, so let's see then, this lose-lose situation for Elizabeth. Let's see what happens, okay? So Elizabeth probably, with a little bit of heavy-handed pressure, has ensured the court did not reach any verdict. All right, so cleverly, if you like, or corrupt, if you like, Elizabeth has found that the court have said there is no verdict at all, which technically means Mary is still a suspect, so she can still be held under arrest. But she doesn't have to kill her. So, I don't know. Another one of those things where I always say, don't I, that Elizabeth is very, very clever, very, very shrewd, very, very political. This is one of those master strokes where she's just going to delay this and drag it out as long as she can. And of course, Mary's going to be like, oh, this is terrible. I am innocent, blah, blah, blah. But Elizabeth has done just enough, probably, to keep her under this house arrest. Now, remember, she's not in chains next to a wall. She's free to live in the house where she's being put up. Walk around the gardens, play music that these rich people do. So hopefully you agree that that's quite a cool outcome for Elizabeth in what did seem almost impossible. All right, so a little summary of the story so far. Just pause the video, go away and write a paragraph, a summary of Mary Queen of Scots' story, why she's a threat. Basically, what I'm asking you to do here is write a paragraph as if you're doing a paragraph for a 12 marker that might say, explain why Mary Queen of Scots was a threat, or it might be explain why Elizabeth faced threats in the years, 1568 to 1579, or whatever it might be. This is a paragraph on Mary Queen of Scots. Consider everything in this video so far. Go back and replay if you need to, or look at your notes that you've made. Why is Mary Queen of Scots a danger? So you want to consider things like her legitimacy, so through the family line. You want to consider the fact that she's got a lot of Catholic support in Europe and in England. So that's why she's dangerous, particularly Philip and the Pope and the French Catholics in France. And anything else that you think is important. So you can get a really strong paragraph out of this, why Mary Queen of Scots is a threat to Elizabeth. Okay, when you're ready, come back to the video and we'll just draw a close to this story. Okay, and then here's another example of a question that you might be asked. Okay, so explain why the Catholic threat to Elizabeth I increased after 1566. And the bullet points they offer is the Dutch revolt, so that thing we did a couple of lessons ago. Why is that a danger to Elizabeth? Bearing in mind the Catholics are very, very close to England, just a short hop over the water. 10,000 troops are in Holland, ready to go and attack England if needs be. So all of that stuff there, Elizabeth getting involved with the sea beggars, that's a lovely little paragraph as well. And then, of course, the second bullet point is Mary Queen of Scots' arrival. So the interesting bit about this question is it says from 1566. So that can start with the letter from the Pope that told the Catholics to stop going to her church. That little bit of rumblings of Catholic opposition. And then your third bullet point, it may well be the letters and then the papal bull and things like that. So we'll have the excommunication and the papal bull, remember, that the Pope sent. You may need to obviously do a little bit of revision for that little topic, but the 3 bullet points for this seem really straightforward. So just Catholic threat. If it was a 16 marker, it might say that Mary Queen of Scots was the biggest Catholic threat to Elizabeth since 1566. How far do you agree? So same thing, you'll have your 3 paragraphs in the middle, Mary's paragraph, the Dutch revolt, and the Pope and his support for the papal bull. You could talk about those 3, but the difference there is, of course, you would have your introduction, your judgment, and your conclusion. This example here is a 12 marker, so you can have a go at that, answering that as one of your fortnightly 16 marks. Have a look in your booklet, or just write it. But I think, looking at this lesson and the whole Catholic threat together, you could quite easily get a nice essay out of this. Also, I've just had a little thought there, another bullet point could be the Northern Rebellion. That was quite serious, wasn't it? That was the Catholic nobility, Westmoreland, Northumberland and Norfolk, massive private armies marching their way down to England. So hopefully you can see a nice little question to go away and do, especially after watching this video. And then just a little bit of a link back, so you can see the note there to a link. The early essays that we did in this topic a couple of lessons ago, looking at Elizabeth's initial problems that she faced, that legitimacy paragraph that we talked about, so looking at, Anne Boleyn was illegitimate, according to Catholics, wife number 1 was never divorced, all of those things that we talked about in that story, the beginning of the topic, the unit, you could now, if you want, add a little bit of Mary Queen of Scots in there, now that you know a bit more, into why that legitimacy paragraph is even more dangerous, because there is a potential Catholic successor who is as legitimate as Elizabeth, if not more, in many people's eyes. So just remember that once we know Mary Queen of Scots, we can definitely squeeze Mary Queen of Scots into loads of different questions, is essentially what I'm saying. Okay, and of course, as always, if you do do these practice questions, we will mark them quite happily. Alright, so once again, thank you very much for watching this lesson. Hopefully it's been helpful and useful for a bit of revision, or if it's your first time of listening. Remember, all of our lessons and our revision resources are available on our website, stchistory.com, and on your Google Classrooms in your one-stop shop section, as well as online and everything else that we've got for this. So please look at these websites and Google Classrooms. Don't be trying to wonder what you can use to revise. You've got plenty of stuff to revise from, and if you need to watch the video or go over a few bits, then feel free to rewind. Otherwise, thank you very much, and if you have any questions about this, please let us know. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.